yeah, we're live now. And that means we've got some folks, hi everybody, some folks looking at us right now. And if you're one of the 70 people that are already tuned in, you're early, but that's fine. Jim, how's everything going in your world? You staying busy?
Everything's going great. 2019 is off to another busy year, and continuing to do the good work of the subcommittee.
That's awesome. And, you know, I know you're a busy guy. You travel quite a bit. I see you out and about once in a while. Where's your travels taking you here in the next couple of months?
Well, things have changed a little bit. The subcommittee is still based in DC. That's where our headquarters is. But back in September, we did away with the permanent office and everybody works remotely now. So I travel back to DC about once a month. I work from Colorado. I'm at my home in Colorado, my home office in Colorado now for this working from home. But so my next travels, other than I head out to DC in a couple of weeks, and then I think the next travel is to maybe Aero.
Okay.
There may be a standards board. I think there's going to be a standards board meeting first week in April. But
all right. Well,
all in March in terms of the travel.
And you're, you know, people may not know this about you, but you're a real approachable guy. So if somebody bumps into you at a conference or something, you don't take offense if they come up and say, "Hey, Jim," and hand you a business card, right? I mean, that's okay to do.
No, to the contrary, and I'll talk a little bit about this during the webinar today. But I'm an appraiser. I have appraisers in my family, and it's a business that I really enjoy talking to appraisers. And I think it's important for me. I haven't done an appraisal in probably 15, 20 years, but I think it's really important for me to stay as in tune with the appraisal community.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so no,
absolutely.
Do not ever hesitate if I'm engaged or busy or something. Just tap me on the shoulder, grab me. I'll be more than happy to talk with you as much as I can.
That's great. And I know you're a busy guy. You know, sometimes I see you flash by because you literally give a lecture or speech or something. You got to hop a flight pretty quick thereafter. Hey, Jim, it's 10 o'clock. We're actually ready to start, believe it or not. So good morning, appraisers. I'm Bryan Reynolds, your host. This is the Appraisal Report Update webinar we do once a month, the fourth Thursday of every month at 10 o'clock Central Standard Time. Brought to you by the fine folks at Appraiser eLearning. These sessions are recorded, so if you get busy and you can't see this in the entirety, feel free to hop back on another time and watch the rest of the broadcast. You're watching us via a YouTube channel, so while you're watching me right now, go ahead and click the subscribe button. That'll keep you in the know. It'll let you know if we have any special webinars, which we have occasionally. We had one last month. Outside our regular scheduled webinar of the fourth Thursday of every month. And finally, we allow you to ask questions. This is not rehearsed. This is live. And sometimes we have some technical difficulties. Sometimes we'll have a little bleep here or there, but we do the best we can. And that's what you get when you go on live. Guys, I'm tickled to death to have our guest this morning, Mr. Jim Park, with the Appraisal Subcommittee. As he said to you early folks that got on a moment ago, he is an appraiser. And a lot of you might not have known that. He's a certified general appraiser. He is here today to talk to us about what the Appraisal Subcommittee is, what they do, and to answer your questions. Jim, welcome, and thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you, Bryan. I'm thrilled to have the opportunity to be a part of this webinar today, and I really appreciate your invitation and the whole eLearning family for inviting me to participate. So thank you.
Great, Jim. Well, again, I'm tickled to death to have you here, and I know this is going to fly by because we've got lots to talk about. We've got lots of viewers, and we've got already we allowed some questions to come in prior to the live stream, so we'll get to as many of those as we can as well. Some of the guys decided to write novels. I mean, it'll take me an hour just to read some of these. So we're going to have to pick pieces of those and go through them. But let's just before we get into what the ASC is and when they came on the scene, because that's where I want to start. But before we get there, if somebody wants to reach out to you, I said a moment ago, you're a pretty approachable guy. How could somebody get in touch with you if they want to correspond with you directly, Jim?
Sure. My email address, it doesn't get much simpler than this, is Jim, Jim, at ASC-alpha-sierra-charlie.gov.
Great. And that goes directly to you?
That goes directly to me. My phone number, my direct phone number is 202-595-7575. And seriously, if you have questions, concerns, if there's something, even if the ASC or I can't satisfy your concern, hopefully I might be able to point you in the right direction to where you can get your questions answered or your concerns addressed.
Great. So, and I'm not going to stall anymore after this last question before we get into the subject matter, but it's killing me. I got to know the sword up there. I love this sword. I mean, where'd that come from? What is it?
Well, it's kind of a good launching pad into my comments here. The swords were given to my father by the 2000 graduating class of the Air Force Academy, which is just a few miles from where I grew up, and my father was he was an appraiser as his second career, but his first career he was United States Air Force pilot. He flew B-24s in World War II. MASH helicopter pilot in Korea, and he was also in Vietnam. So in honor of his service, the 2000 graduating class from the Air Force Academy gave him those swords.
Oh my goodness, how wonderful.
A few years ago, so I have them in my office.
Oh, well, thank you to your father for his service. And man, and I had no idea what that was. I noticed it right before we went live. I said, don't cut that sword out. I like it in the shot. It looks good. But I really had no idea what that answer was going to be. And what a great answer. So again, thank you for being here. So let's just jump right in. I got in this business in the early 80s. Started in mortgage banking, and somebody just bumped into me and said, "Hey, have you ever thought about being an appraiser?" And I said, "Well, what do I got to do?" And he said, "Well, I got to give you a clipboard, a camera, and a tape measure, and you're an appraiser." And that was kind of a joke, but to some degree, that was really kind of true. And in some states, we still have voluntary states where you don't have to be licensed to actually use the name appraiser, not certified appraiser, but just appraiser. So then we have the savings and loan crisis. FIREA was born. And how did ASC come to be in existence during that time?
Okay. Well, there's a lot of confusion regarding the subcommittee and the regulatory system in general. So generally, when I give one of these talks, I start up trying to set a baseline so we're all starting from the same level of knowledge in terms of how the system works, because it is somewhat unique, somewhat different. So so there's some specifics that I think are worth going through. Before I get into that, I just want to touch a little bit more on my background. I mentioned talk about my dad a little bit, and he after retiring from the Air Force became an appraiser. So I started. I was out there holding the dumb end of the tape when I started about 12 years old.
Oh, wow.
This day and age when you can hardly get a trainee to get out and walk through a property, it's kind of hard to imagine taking your 12-year-old out. But
right.
So I've been doing appraisals. I started full time right after college, and and which was quite a while ago. So I've been in the business for quite some time. I've worked in the banking, mortgage lending fields. Spent some time working on the staff at the Appraisal Foundation, and as you mentioned, I'm a certified general appraiser in the Commonwealth of Virginia. I've been
another Commonwealth. I love it.
Yeah, I've had Kentucky.
Yeah,
I've had the privilege of being in this position as the executive director of the subcommittee for it'll be 10 years. I can't believe it. 10 years next.
Congratulations. That's awesome.
So, so with that little background myself, we'll dive into the subcommittee. The subcommittee we're an independent executive branch federal government agency.
Okay.
We're part of the FFIEC, the Federal Financial Institutions Examination Council, but we're still independent of them. So they have certain authorities over the subcommittee, but we are not part of a department or anything like that. We're an independent executive branch agency based in Washington, D.C. We're a small agency in terms of our staff size. We have 12 staff members. They're spread out in different parts of the country. The majority are in the D.C. area, but we have people all over the country. The subcommittee is made up of 7 federal financial regulatory agencies. And while our staff might be small, the makeup of our board and the agencies that make up the subcommittee is pretty large. We have the 3 banking agencies, the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is the chair of the subcommittee at this time, the OCC, the FDIC. We also have the National Credit Union Administration, the CFPB, HUD, and FHFA, the Federal Housing Finance Agency, who oversees Fannie and Freddie. So just about every regulatory agency that has significant regulatory authority over the commercial and residential mortgage lending arenas are represented on the subcommittee. We have approximately a $4 million budget, which is not even a rounding error for most government agencies. Speaking of our budget, Bryan, do you know where the subcommittee's funding comes from?
You know, I'm just going to guess it's coming from me, not just me, but all of our viewers. I believe that's where it's coming from.
Yes, we do appreciate your philanthropy, Bryan, in supporting the subcommittee. But now every probably most of the people on this webinar today are appraisers, so all of the funding comes from appraisers, from the National Registry fees. I'll talk more about the National Registry and the fees in a little bit, but it's important to know that the funding for the subcommittee, my salary, the grants that we give to the foundation, the states, it all comes from practicing appraisers who are on the National Registry.
And I want to focus on I want to focus on the ASC today. I mean, that's our topic, but just some of our viewers out there might be a little confused, and I want to remind everyone watching that we have a pretty broad audience. We have practicing appraisers, we have retired appraisers, we have regulatory board members, we have real estate professionals, we have AMCs, we have mortgage lenders, and we have the public at large. So our audience is growing, and thank you for viewing our webinars. We really appreciate you. But Jim, let's just talk real briefly. A lot of our viewers are a little confused. You've got this thing out there called the Appraisal Foundation, and they're the ones that create USPAP and say we have to take a class or whatnot. And so what is the difference? And the Appraisal Foundation is not a governmental agency. I think folks get confused on that as well. But what's the difference between the ASC and the Appraisal Foundation?
Very good question. Well, the foundation was actually, this whole regulatory setup came to be as a result of the savings and loan crisis back in the late 80s. In 1989, FIREA was passed, Financial Institutions Reform, Recovery, and Enforcement Act, and Title 11 in that act specifically created this system. And in 1982, the states implemented the system. 1992. The foundation already existed. The foundation was created back in 1987 by the larger appraisal organizations at the time. They saw that licensing was probably coming. Some type of federal regulation of appraisers was in the offing due to the S&L crisis. So they got together, established the foundation, wrote the initial uniform standards. So the foundation is a non-profit 501c3 that because they had established the first set of standards and were out there, Congress, which is probably the most unique part of the system, Congress gave the foundation the authority to set uniform standards for appraisal practice as it relates to federally related transactions. Congress also gave the foundation the authority through the AQB, the Appraiser Qualifications Board, to set the minimum qualification requirements for appraisers. So the regulatory system is made up of three main players. You've got the Appraisal Foundation, the states, and the federal government, or the Appraisal Subcommittee. Through their congressional authority to write USPAP and the qualification criteria, the foundation writes those requirements. They then issue those requirements to appraisers and to the states. The states, the second piece of the puzzle here, of the regulatory puzzle, the states implement what the foundation requires, as well as what other state laws or regulations they might have to deal with in their specific state. So the states were really, frankly, most of the most difficult work is done in terms of the regulatory system. They implement the minimum requirements. They can go above the minimum requirements. They just can't go below them. Mm-hmm. And they administer all the aspects of an occupational licensing program within a state. So they're determining the qualification of the applicants and whether or not they should be credentialed. And they're also counseling and disciplining appraisers when needed, when they violated a state or federal law.
So let's talk about that for just a second. So the primary thing that I'm getting out of this is the Appraisal Foundation's a nonprofit organization made up of boards. They create the minimum criteria and the minimum standards. And again, the states can exceed that if they like. So the Appraisal Subcommittee is an actual governmental agency. You're probably as high as you get, right? You're the big dog here. Who makes sure that the states do things that they're supposed to be doing correctly? I mean, who's monitoring the state regulatory authorities?
Well, the role of the subcommittee, which is the third part of the regulatory program here, is exactly what your question addresses. It's the subcommittee's role is one of oversight. I like to think of it as more of a support role. The subcommittee provides support by doing compliance reviews of the states. At least our relationship with the states is what most people would think of as a more classic regulatory setup. And we have authority over the states to enforce the requirements that are promulgated by the foundation and otherwise through Title 11. So at least once every 2 years, the policy managers, generally 2 policy managers, will go out and do a compliance review of the state. It's usually a 2 or 3 day process where we review files, uh, enforcement files, application files, all kinds of things to determine if the state is, or determine what level of compliance the state has with Title 11 and other requirements such as our policy statements.
So that's very interesting.
We provide support in terms of compliance reviews for the states. We also provide support in terms of monitoring and reviewing the Appraisal Foundation. Although they're independent, we have no authority over the foundation boards other than providing advice and giving input. And we provide grants to both the foundation as well as the states.
Fantastic. So what's interesting is that, and we've got some questions coming in, and we'll get to those in just a minute. And I encourage our viewers, if you have a question, now's the time. Shoot these questions in or anytime during the broadcast, and we'll get to as many of those as we can. So, Jim, the state regulatory authorities, they're the entities that police practicing appraisers in their given state or commonwealth. And so if we make a mistake, they're the watchful eye to protect the public, right? Mm-hmm. So my understanding, based on what you said, is the appraisal subcommittee is the one that is actually policing the states, because quite frankly, who's watching what they do? What if they make a mistake? So when you go in and do these audits, you said it's about a 2 to 3 day process. You're checking and making sure that the states are doing what they're supposed to be doing. What if they're not? What if they fail this particular audit? What are the ramifications to the states? What kind of trouble can they get into, and what's corrective measures there?
Well, that's where the swords come in.
Great.
Just kidding. As part of the compliance review, we rate the state in terms of their Title 11 compliance. We rate them on a scale of excellent to poor.
Okay.
Right now, the states are really doing a good job in terms of their compliance. In 2018, 21 states were reviewed. 6 were found to be excellent. 10 were found to be good, and 5 were found to need improvement. So no states were found to be not satisfactory or poor. Good. And that's been in place for the last several years, which we're pleased to see. In terms of what can we do if a state is not in compliance, ultimately the subcommittee's most significant hammer is non-recognition of the state program. So if a state were out of compliance, if they were found to be poor, and this would work with the state. I mean, this would be a process that would likely take not only months, but probably years. If a state got to the point of being poor and was out of compliance with Title 11 in significant ways, ultimately the subcommittee could deem them to be the subcommittee could engage in a non-recognition process, and the state would no longer be able to, appraisers would, if it came to fruition, appraisers would not be able to provide their services for federally related transactions in that state.
Wow, that's significant.
Yeah, and there's a lot of discussion and frankly confusion around what a federally related transaction is and is not.
And actually, that's a great leeway. We have a question there from Scott, and you can go ahead and knock that one out, because he asked specifically, what is an FRT, or what is a federally related transaction? He says, I've actually had 2 answers. I've heard 2 answers, and he is wanting to know what the correct answer is.
Well, I will do my best to give you the correct answer. When Title 11 was first passed and then enacted, there was a realization. Well, there were 2 terms that were used: real estate related financial transactions, and then a subset was created within those real estate related financial transactions called federally related transactions, or FRTs. And at the outset, those two terms or concepts were virtually, or transaction types were virtually synonymous. But there was a recognition that not every transaction required an appraisal. So there, at the outset, there were the threshold or de minimis level below which transactions are not required to have an appraisal. It was initially proposed at 15,000, went to 50, went to 100, and then by 1994 it had gone up to $250,000. So that all of those, and not only the threshold was increased, there were a number of exemptions that were introduced to the appraisal requirement by the banking agencies. 12 exemptions, I believe it is, and that includes loans that are qualify for sale to Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, insured by FHA, or guaranteed by VA. So none of those transactions are require appraisal, and not only do they not require appraisal, they are. It's been clarified in the last few years that they are not FRTs at all. They're not federally related transactions, which has introduced some confusion into the system now that realization has really taken hold.
Right.
So getting back around to the real question here, an FRT is it's easier to say what it's not.
Right.
So an FRT is not sales, as I said, that can be sold on. They're not transactions that Fannie Freddie purchase, FHA insures, VA guarantees. So the long and short of it is less than 10%, maybe significantly less than 10% of the transactions, both commercial and residential transactions in aggregate, less than 10% are federally related transactions. And with recent increases or proposed increases to the threshold, that percentage will probably go down.
Right, right. Yeah, that's probably an amazing fact for many of our viewers. Hey, let's
just real quick, just to circle back to the registry and how this ties into the registry. Appraisers have to be on the registry to be eligible for federally related transactions. That's the kind of the baseline. But the registry and licensing has really gone past just the FRT definition now. And even though they're not FRTs, the GSEs still require appraisals to be done by appraisers who are on the National Registry.
Right. That's how
it actually has a statute that requires it.
That's how it ties back in. You mentioned the National Registry, so let's talk about that for a minute. For many of our viewers, they may not even know that exists. I know a lot of times in my live classes, I'll pull up the National Registry and show how you can pull up an appraiser and find what states they're licensed or credentialed in. I show up on the ASC National Registry as Illinois. That's where I started, Tennessee and Kentucky. So it's kind of interesting. So let our viewers know, what is the National Registry and how can somebody access that information?
Sure. Good question. Thank you. The registry was something, it was a requirement of Title 11 for the subcommittee to establish. And again, it's for the purpose of identifying appraisers who have met the minimum qualification requirements to be on the National Registry to perform appraisals for FRTs.
And if somebody gets in trouble, all right, they did something they shouldn't have been doing, their state actually disciplines them, they have to adhere to that disciplinary action. What happens? Is their name removed from the registry? What what ramifications occur to the appraiser from the ASC's perspective?
Sure. Well, couple things. The registry, it's important for people to understand that the information that populates the registry comes from the states. It doesn't come from the subcommittee. We take in data regarding appraisers who are licensed and certified in a given state, and then that data is then displayed on the registry. So it all comes from the states, and that data includes, you know, your name, address, but it also includes your disciplinary action history. There are two sides to the website, to the National Registry and our website at the subcommittee. There's a private side and a public side. The public side shows all the appraisers who are licensed or certified, but it also shows the disciplinary and the active disciplinary action history on any given appraiser. So if your license is currently suspended, if it's been revoked, or if you've surrendered your license in lieu of a disciplinary action, those actions will show on the National Registry.
Okay, so you don't
to those is the big three.
You don't remove an appraiser from the registry then. Their name's still there. It's just those disciplinary actions do show beside their name, right?
We do not remove appraisers from the registry. States, there have been a few exceptions to this, but it's very rare. Generally, the state is the one who's removing adding or removing appraisers to the registry.
How many appraisers are there on the registry as of now? Or if you don't know the exact number, an approximate number, how many appraisers are showing up on the registry?
There's about 94,700.
94.
Let me clarify something, right? You asked how many appraisers are on the registry.
Mm-hmm.
The registry is a registry of credentials, not of appraiser bodies. So you just mentioned you have how many? 4 or 5 credentials?
Two active.
Yeah. So you're going to show up on the registry twice.
So like 2 people.
15, somewhere between 15 or 20% of the appraisers have multiple licenses. Some have 2 licenses, some have 25 licenses.
Okay.
So right now we don't know exactly how many credentials that 94,700, we don't know exactly how many bodies that 94,700 number of credentials.
I'm with you.
Translates to, which is why we've been working on a project. I'm sure some have heard me talk about the unique identification number project, so that we can issue a unique ID to every appraiser who's on the registry, and by virtue of that, we'll be able to really start to get to the bottom of how many appraisers are in each state, and
yeah, that would be nice.
A uniquely identified every appraiser. I've been licensed in 4 different states.
Right.
And on some of my licenses, my name isn't exactly the same. So there is the possibility that if somebody's looking for my disciplinary action history, if they put in James R. Park, they might not get my full disciplinary action history.
Gotcha.
Because we don't have this unique, we don't have this DNA or unique ID right now. That's something we've been working on for years. We've got 42 states who are now participating voluntarily.
Oh, good.
And we're working with the remainder of the states to get this implemented.
So that just opens the door for a little further discussion on that. So there's about 95,000 credentialed, points, I guess.
Credentials.
But if I had 14, I'm still one person. So those numbers are skewed in that the credentials don't really reflect the true number of appraisers. It reflects the true number of credentials. So you sent us in a little chart, and there's always a hot topic as are we losing appraisers, right? And there's always a natural loss. I mean, people retire, people die, right? So we have the number of appraisers go down as a consequence of that. But historically, or back in the day, I guess we had so many people getting into the profession, it kind of offset that. And I don't think we're going to get into the debate whether or not there's a shortage today, but let's have you talk slightly on the numbers, where they were and where we're at today. And do you see us going back up, or are we still going down?
Well, in terms of credentials, unfortunately, we're still going down. Okay. Did you put the chart? Is that chart displayed?
I can do that, or Benjamin can. Let me see. Ben, do you want to do that? Because, I mean, I can do it.
Sure. Give me just 1 second.
I've got it up until Ben does.
Is it up?
Yeah, it is.
I think this is interesting. What this chart represents, and I'm sure there's a number of you who have seen this over and over again because it's something I use quite a bit. But what this chart shows is the credential history of the National Registry since its inception in 1992. The top line, the blue line, is the total number of credentials. Let's see. The red line is certified residential. The green line is certified general. The yellow line or gold line is licensed, and then the hashed line is mortgage originations. And it makes, I think it follows common sense that as mortgage originations go, so do the number of appraisers, supply and demand.
Sure.
And what you can see in the blue line is right around 2000, you saw a real increase in the number of credentials being issued. So from 2000 to roughly 2000 to 2008, you saw this real run up in the number of appraisers getting into the business. Well, what else was going on at that time?
Yeah, it was right before the housing crisis.
Well, yeah, you saw that's when all the subprime loans were really ramping up, and mortgage originations, as you can see, also spiked big time right around that time period. Well, the bubble burst, and as mortgage originations flowed down, so did the number of credentials on the registry. But I think one of the more interesting things to note here is we've got a few more interesting things we've got more certified general appraisers today than we've ever had. The number of certified residentials have tailed off a little bit, but not significantly. Where the majority of the losses have occurred is in the licensed category. Mm-hmm. And in my opinion, back when Congress barred HUD from using licensed appraisers in 2008 in the Housing Economic Recovery Act, HERA, it really led to some real problems, particularly in rural markets, because that's where a lot of these licensed appraisers practiced. Not all the licensed appraisers got out of the business. Some of them graduated. Some of them went to a certified credential, but quite a few of them probably got out of the business. Since the peak of 121,400 credentials, roughly, we're down right around 25,000 credentials. Over 22,000 of those credential losses come from the license category alone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that it was amazing HUD did that. It was a little surprising to me because you could have an appraiser that's been an appraiser for 30 years or something, and they've been doing FHA appraisals for 20, 25 years, And then suddenly, boom, as a change of that requirement, they could no longer appraise FHA for FHA anymore. It was a little, we thought they would grandfather those, at least I thought they'd grandfather those folks in and just start the new policy. And if you wanted to be a new appraiser on, you had to be certified residential, but they didn't. I was wrong. I was wrong. They said, nope, you got to be CR to do these. So it was a little surprising. Jim, we get
one thing to understand is back in 2008, prior to the Dodd-Frank Act, states weren't required to follow the AQB criteria when it comes to licensed appraisers. So states had various qualification requirements for the licensed appraiser, and there were significant problems with licensed appraisers in terms of mortgage lending. I mean, I saw it with the lender that I worked for. But in 2010, the Dodd-Frank Act brought the license category underneath the AQB, underneath the ASC. So now you've got a license category that there's a lot more continuity. The education requirements, the examination requirements, experience requirements all fall under the AQB now. So I think some of the issues that may have existed in prior years around that license category, some of those issues have most likely been resolved.
You know, Jim, it's amazing. We're already at the halfway mark, and we've just began. We've got a lot of questions coming in. I want to get to some of those, but we are at the halfway mark. We may have you hang on a little longer than an hour today if we can keep you in front of the camera and on the hot seat. I'd like to remind our viewers you are watching the Appraisal Report webinar. My name is Bryan Reynolds. It's brought to you by Appraiser eLearning, the fourth Thursday of every month. And guys, the price is fantastic. It's free. There's no charge to you. So why not go ahead and click the subscribe button. Keep yourself in the know. We're gracious, very, very honored to have Mr. Jim Park from the Appraisal Subcommittee on today. The session is being recorded. It's live, so anything can happen. If you can't watch it in its entirety, you can go back and watch the recorded version at any time. We encourage your questions. As you can imagine, we're getting a bunch, and we still have some that were sent in advance we want to go over. So if we don't get all the questions answered today, I apologize, and maybe we can talk Jim into corresponding with some of you folks directly and answering some of those questions. Jim, again, thanks for being here. Let's fire off a few questions, and I'm going to knock a couple out that has already been addressed a little bit, but just for further clarity, we had two questions, one from T and the other one from Michael, who says, how is an FHA or VA loan not an FRT?
Well, you'd have to talk to, you'd have to ask that question to Congress and the banking agencies.
Okay. Daystar asked you a question. Is there any guess, and he's not going to hold you to this, is there any guess on the possible number of appraisers there are worldwide? Any idea on that, Jim?
Absolutely no guess at all.
Yeah, I don't know.
Keep in mind, you've got appraisers, you've got real estate appraisers, you've got business valuers, you have personal property appraisers. Yeah. Most places around the world.
Yeah. So
little information as we have here in the United States, we have probably a lot more information than most countries. So
I know in some countries they refer to appraisers as valuers. I find that kind of interesting. Yeah, so you don't say I'm an appraiser, you say I'm a valuer. You know, that's actually kind of cool because that is what we are, right? Or we're developing opinions of value, I suppose. So let me ask you another couple here. Michael says the question should be, what is the number of practicing appraisers, both full-time, part-time? Appraisal certification is difficult to obtain, and few will give it up even after they're semi-retired or retired, or maybe like you, Jim, you said you haven't actually done an appraisal in quite some time. I know a lot of folks that serve on regulatory boards. They certainly keep their license active, but they're not practicing. So it's a great question, Michael. And you know, I don't know if that unique identification number that you were talking about, Jim, if there would be a place on there to yeah, or if that's just a survey question, you know, how many of you are actually practicing? You know, that's more of a.
I think it would be great if a survey like that were to be undertaken, because we just don't know how many people are out there in a position like I am, where whether you're doing appraisal reviews or administration or whatever, you still have your credential, but you're not part of the supply and demand of appraisers out there. I have seen, now this is strictly a residential number, but I have in presentations that the GSEs have given, they track through their systems unique appraisers, and from what they've said, between 40 and 45,000, they typically see between 40 and 45,000 unique appraisers. So that is the closest approximation I've seen to how many appraisers are actually out there doing residential appraisals.
Right.
I think it would be, and it's sorely needed, a comprehensive survey of this profession to address a number of issues and really start to get to the bottom of some of the underlying concerns that a lot of folks have about the future of the profession and the current status of the profession.
Right. Let me ask you a question from Chuck, and he's asking a question about the states, and our viewers need to remember Jim's with the ASC. They do police the states, though. So, Jim, the question from Chuck is, why are states not enforcing AMC to pay customary and reasonable fees to the appraisers, states failing to enforce mandated requirements for CNR?
Oh,
that's a tough one.
That's an easy one.
Yeah.
Yeah, the whole customary and reasonable fee has been a difficult concept, I think, to really implement at the ground level because of a myriad of legal issues surrounding it. The states are just now in different states of establishing AMC programs. In 2018, the subcommittee, just last year, we stood up the National Registry of AMCs. We started doing our compliance reviews of state AMC programs. So we're now starting the process of oversight of the state AMC program. So we'll learn a lot about this as these compliance reviews progress over the next few years. I wish I could give you a real good answer on the customary and reasonable fee issue. I think it's something that you just have to work with your states on, and what their interpretation is and how they intend to enforce the customary and reasonable fee.
Yeah, and I don't want to stay on this topic very long, but I see as part of the challenge with that is, what is customary and reasonable? That's been one of the big hot topics for a while now, and I like the last part of your answer where you talked about get involved. Appraisers need to get involved. You can certainly make a difference if you get involved. The Appraisal Foundation, when they're talking about changing USPAP, for crying out loud, they issue exposure drafts. They want your opinion. They want to know what the appraisal community thinks. So we've got some other questions, and we'll get back to those in just a minute. But I want to talk to you a little bit about probably a hot topic that's been going around for the last several months, and that's these appraisal waiver requests. There's my understanding there's a provision in FIREA that allows not necessarily to waive the appraisal, although that's how everybody's referring to it, but it kind of gives them some leeway under certain circumstances to not have an appraisal done by a credentialed individual, if I understand that right. So Jim, talk about that a little bit. What is the provision? Has it ever been granted? And how many requests have you had recently requesting these waivers?
Well, there is a section in Title 11 that allows the appraisal subcommittee to waive appraiser credentialing requirements in a specific specific geographic location if there's a demonstrable scarcity of appraisers in that geography.
Okay.
It has been, just to back up momentarily, there's confusion between these waivers and the GSE waivers. They're completely separate waiver issues. So the GSEs, given certain parameters and characteristics in a loan, may waive the appraisal requirement. So in that case, there's no appraisal required.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Temporary waiver provision that the ASC has under Title 11 is to temporarily waive the credentialing requirements if there's a scarcity of appraisers in a certain area. So that means that the subcommittee could waive experience requirements, education requirements, examination requirements, supervisory trainee appraiser requirements.
Wow.
Or all the above.
Okay.
But what it doesn't waive is the requirement for that institution to still obtain a USPAP compliant appraisal when an appraisal is required.
Okay. Now, has a waiver of any kind ever been granted?
Yes. In 1992, CNMI, the Mariana Islands, was unable to find education providers. They just had a handful of appraisers before distance education, and they couldn't find anybody to provide the education. And the subcommittee granted them a two-year waiver, but they were still required. The state was still required to require USPAP compliant appraisals for FRTs.
So you still had to have appraisals done by credentialed folks that adhered to USPAP. It's just they didn't have to. Some of the educational requirements was laxed a little bit temporarily, right? Where'd you say that was? The Mariana Islands?
Yes.
Where the heck is the Mariana Islands? I want to go. It sounds like a cool place. Maybe I'll teach you
the Pacific.
Maybe I'll teach a class. Maybe I'll teach you.
Somewhere around Guam.
Oh, okay. Maybe I won't. I don't know. We'll see. All right. So in 1992, one has been granted.
Yes, sir.
From 1992 until, I don't know, 2018, maybe? Have you had any other requests?
We did get a request last year.
Okay.
Actually, the year before last now. Towards the end of 2017, we received a request from a bank in Tennessee, community bank in Tennessee, who was requesting temporary waiver of credentialing requirements in what essentially was the Nashville area and several of its suburbs.
So you had a bank. And I want to make sure I understand this. Now, this is coming right from the director of the ASC, Mr. Jim Park. You had a bank who said there was a scarcity of appraisers to do residential appraisal work or commercial appraisal, whichever the case may be, in Nashville, Tennessee. Is that correct?
It included the counties that Nashville's in.
Okay. So it's more than just
Nashville. Their bigger concern was some of the rural counties surrounding Nashville, and Nashville is as many of you know, has exploded and is lots of growth there. So, appraisers who may have been willing to drive a little ways in years past, if there's plenty of work right in your neighborhood, they may not be so willing to take an hour drive or so to do the
let's face it. I'd rather do appraisal work in my backyard than have to drive, an hour away to do that. But so what happened?
I think this Tennessee example is a really good one, though, for people to understand. While there may be differences of opinion of whether there's a shortage of appraisers in the Nashville area or not, what it did is, ultimately, we went through the process that the subcommittee has to go through, the legal process that we have to go to entertain a waiver request. It was ultimately denied. But what's happened since then, I think, is really important. There have been a couple of meetings between the community bankers, the Tennessee Appraisal Commission, the Tennessee Banking Commission. There in Nashville, the Appraisal Foundation has been part of it. I've been part of it. And it's really been a great exercise in appraisers and the lending community and the regulatory community coming together to try to figure out how do we address some of the supply issues that we may have with appraisers. I'm sure everybody realizes there can be all kinds of different flavors of why somebody thinks there's a shortage or not a shortage of appraisers. But the spirit of working together, the spirit of trying to solve a problem that is everybody is struggling with, or a lot of people are struggling with, it was great to see. And they're now intending to have additional meetings together, maybe set up some type of website or a web page where lenders can find appraisers in these rural communities. I think it's important not to get lost in this discussion about shortages or no shortages. There's always been a shortage of appraisers in rural markets, at least since I've been in business. I've done a lot of rural appraisals myself. And they can be more expensive for obvious reasons. They could be more time consuming for obvious reasons. But I think it'd be great if the appraisal or valuation community could get together with regulators and lenders and start talking about how we address some of these problems. It's a problem when you've got a $60,000 refinance of a property in North or South Dakota or some rural market, and it takes 8 weeks and a couple $1,000s to get that appraisal done.
Yeah.
Yeah,
it really is. And I can relate to that. So where I live in the Commonwealth of Kentucky, I service about four counties, and a couple of the counties that we have do not, there is no MLS in those counties. The courthouse is not online. I mean, we're back in the days where I have to physically drive to the courthouse, go into the assessor's office, pull the tax card, find the deed booking page, go over to the clerk's office and actually find the deed book and unbind it and copy it and buy and put it back. So, in a lot of areas, I think, of the country, we still face that. And it is, time is money. It takes me a lot more time to do the research and get that information than having it right here at our fingertips. Like we're conversing right now. You're in a Commonwealth, I'm in a Commonwealth, and it's not the same one, but through the power of technology, we're able to have a conversation and have a couple hundred people watching us. Some of the rural communities don't have that luxury. You have to physically go in and pull that. So it is a real challenge. Hey, how many appraisers got involved? And you might not know the exact number, but when this bank was requesting a waiver, and if they were granted that, I believe it was for a year, they wouldn't have had to use an appraiser to do the appraisal, right? How many credentialed folks, or did you have any voices from the appraisal community down in Tennessee and, quite frankly, around the country chiming in on this topic.
Well, we got a number of, I don't know the exact number, we got a number of comments. When we had a public meeting in Washington, D.C., the subcommittee did to hear the request, and we had several appraisers, I would guess a dozen or so appraisers attend that meeting. It generated a lot of interest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think you got some letters from appraisal organizations. I know the NAA drafted a letter. I believe the Institute, the Tennessee Appraiser Coalition. I think it got a lot of folks' interest. So that one failed. That was not. There was no permission granted to deviate from normal practice. Have there been any others? Do you have any pending right now requesting some relief?
Well, the state of North Dakota, the governor of North Dakota, actually wrote the subcommittee a letter in August of 2018, exploring the idea of a temporary waiver for the entire state of North Dakota. Mm. The letter implies some authority to the subcommittee that the subcommittee doesn't have. So in September, we wrote a letter back to North Dakota, asking a few questions, trying to get some clarification on exactly what they're requesting that's within our authority, and we have yet to hear back.
Gotcha. And that's the only one you have that's going on right now? You don't have any other submissions?
We do not.
Okay. So appraisers ought to really stay focused on that. I believe if something like that happens and you want your opinion heard, you need to reach out to Mr. Park or someone and kind of come together. Hey, Jim, we're running out of time. So before we completely run out of time, let me get to some of these questions. And we had some that were written in advance. So I'm gonna ask you. And again, some of these are so long it would take a while to read. Josh asked a question. He first of all thanked you for being a part of the webinar, and we are very appreciative for you letting appraisers have the ability to reach out to you. But Josh said, at a recent ASB, you mentioned if a state or territory does not have an AMC program in place by a deadline, it will not impact the AMC's ability to engage appraisers per se. Is this correct understanding? Could you elaborate on the implications of the situation in states with a program and those territories that are not participating?
Okay, so states have until June of 2020. Well, let me back up. The Dodd-Frank Act required the banking agencies, an interagency group, there's more than just the banking agencies, but an interagency group to write registration and AMC registration and supervision regulations and promulgate those regulations to the states. So the agencies completed that in 2015 and established 2018 as August of 2018 as the end of the implementation period for states to get their statutes and rules in place. It also provided a 1-year extension for states who weren't quite there, for states who had made progress but hadn't been able to get the horse back in the barn. So the states have been working toward that for the last several years. There was a provision to give the extension. 26 states asked for that and were granted that extension. So they now have to have their program in place by August of 2019. As I mentioned earlier, we're starting to do our compliance reviews. So if we go into a state and the state is participating, and I don't think I mentioned this, states don't have to participate. But if you don't participate, then AMCs aren't going to be able to provide their services for FRT transactions. But and at this point, all the states except for a few, except for the territories, as Josh has alluded to, all the states are saying that they're participating.
Oh,
but if we go into the compliance review and a state says that they're participating and they haven't gotten their rules in place, they haven't gotten their statutes in place, or for whatever reason, they just have not been able to get it up and running, that doesn't mean that AMCs would, that restriction would kick in. It would just mean that the state has a compliance review issue with the subcommittee.
I gotcha.
So, we might ding them. We might come down hard on them. I don't know. It depends on what's going on. But
it doesn't necessarily
be a situation where AMCs would be barred from providing their services. That's only when a state says we're not participating.
Okay.
Now, if we go in and do a compliance review and a state says we're participating, but there's no draft legislation, there's no draft rules, there's been nothing.
They're not trying
to indicate that they're actually participating.
Then we got a problem.
It would take time. The industry would see it coming, but in an egregious case like that.
Sure. Okay, very good. Tim asked a couple of questions. Actually, he asked several questions, but we're going to get to a couple of them, okay? Tim asked a question. In states that have declared evaluations to be appraisals, will that state's appraisal board enforce evaluations as it enforces USPAP? By what authority would the state board take unto itself that responsibility? And then finally, he also asked along the same lines, when a non-appraiser performs an evaluation, to which authority, state or federal, is that non-appraiser subject? Why and how? And I'm going to add my own question. Do they report to anybody?
Boy, you guys came up with the easy one, didn't you? So evaluations versus appraisals. There are, I don't know the exact number, but I believe it's the majority of states are considered to be mandatory. What does that mean? That means if you're a mandatory state, that means that any market value estimate of real estate has to come from an appraiser, a licensed or credentialed appraiser.
Right.
There are mandatory states that have specific carve-outs for real estate agents doing BPOs or CMAs. There may be a carve-out that if you're an employee of a federally regulated financial institution, there are those kinds of carve-outs. But generally speaking, in states that are mandatory, the concept of an evaluation, unless there's a carve-out, doesn't really exist, because an evaluation is an estimate of market value, which is an appraisal. In the other states, those evaluations are largely, I don't know that there's any enforcement other than through the federal regulatory agencies when they do their audits of the lender who used those products.
So along that same line, let me ask you this from Wells. He said, please talk about bifurcating the appraisal process or weakening gates to entry. How does that expose the government and public to loss risk?
Well, I think it's like any new process, and it depends on who you talk to about how new this process is. I can see the allure of bifurcated appraisals. Having run a couple of large appraisal organizations, I can see complications in it. Now you got an inspector to deal with, you got the appraiser to deal with. What happens when there's questions from the appraiser to the inspector? Is the appraiser going to know who the inspector is? So I think that there's, and maybe a lot smarter people than I have figured out how to make this work. But I just wonder if there is a real benefit to having that bifurcated system. I can see where in some cases it would be very beneficial.
Yeah, we could spend an hour talking about evaluations and bifurcating.
Yeah, I mean, I could. There's a lot to talk about in this, and a lot to unwrap.
Right.
I mean,
right.
I don't want to throw cold water on the bifurcated process, but I think that there's a lot of questions that remain to be seen in terms of the actual outcome, ability of those valuations, and I think that there's a lot of, particularly at the state level, regulatory concerns. What happens when some of these appraisals start getting turned into the state board?
Yeah, I think the big pushback from most practicing appraisers are more what we refer to as the hybrid appraisal, where they're sending somebody that they don't know out to do the inspection process, and the appraiser's back and they have resistance. But there's always change around the corner, and I tell folks, be prepared, because this industry is going to change just like most things change. If you don't believe that, look in the mirror. Things are going to change. And, the bifurcated, I do commercial work too, and it's not uncommon for especially on the commercial side, to have a team of appraisers working on a project, especially the more complex assignments. So if you can figure out how to do that from a business perspective on the residential side, I think an appraiser probably would be more willing to accept that if you had an appraiser doing the inspection while you have another appraiser doing the analysis. I mean, they're both appraisers, or at least someone they know that's properly trained. That's back in the days when we were able to send the trainee out and do the inspection. You've spent time with them. You feel comfortable. They're supposed to be competent before they go out. Bifurcated is very similar to that process. So there's a lot to talk about on that topic, and we're not going to solve all those problems today. I have one more question, or one more topic I want to slide in. I know we're going late, and I apologize, Jim, but the complaint issues. Okay. And we had a question from a gentleman, and this is one that I ask frequently. In fact, we're doing a webinar coming up in May that our viewers, you're not going to want to miss it. It's about an appraiser that had a complaint filed, and he took action not only to defend himself, he filed suit against the complainant. And I think all our viewers would be very interested in hearing how that story unfolds. So that webinar is scheduled for May. Be sure you come back and join us. So this Robert asked a question. No, he did not. I'm sorry. It was from Kane. He said, policy number 7 requires state appraisal licensing agencies to look beyond the allegations of a complaint. In other words, look at the entire report, look at the entire work file for any USPAP obligation or USPAP violations. How does addressing concerns not recognized by the complainant improve their trust, since most complaints are filed by unintended angry folks about value? So a homeowner's mad because they didn't get the value they think the property's worth. How do disciplinary actions for insufficient highest and best use help to improve the complainant's trust? So this is a hot topic. So, and I've voiced concern about this personally. Somebody files a complaint. Jim, you got the square footage wrong. And they submit that to your state regulatory authority. The investigator comes out, they look at it, and they say, well, Jim didn't do anything wrong. Jim actually got the square footage right. But since we have the report, we looked at it, we looked in his work file, and there's some other deficiencies over here. So now we're going to get you.
Yeah. And when I first started at the subcommittee, this was one of the first questions I asked, because it was a point of frustration for me too. I had known several people who had gotten caught up in this type of a scenario. And what I've learned is that when you're conducting an investigation, it doesn't matter, this is just applies to pretty much all types of investigations. You may go in having one thing reported, but in your investigation, you discover other abnormalities or other transgressions. So if you're a police officer and you get a call that there's loud music, you show up at the house, you walk in, and there's obviously a robbery taking place, you're going to investigate the robbery. Mm-hmm. You're not just going to say, hey, I showed up to address loud music. I'm not going to deal with the fact that a robbery took place.
Right.
So it's most investigative bodies that I'm aware of, when they're looking at one issue, they're not going to close their eyes to another issue.
Right, right. And
now the flip side of that is you can find something to pick at on just about every appraisal.
Right.
The USPAP says perfection's not the objective here and is not attainable.
Right.
So then it's really left up to the discretion of the board. Are they going to, is this an opportunity if you didn't do the highest and best use right, but the basis of the complaint was found to not hold water, but we found these other things. A lot of boards will just counsel the appraiser and say, this isn't what you were brought in here for, but you could have had a better explanation on this, that, or the other. You could have we found this to be slightly off. Right. I don't know, it'd be a big deal, but be careful in the future. But
yeah, I think that would
boards that will say you didn't follow my interpretation or the letter of the law in my view of USPAP, and we're gonna get you.
Yeah, and I think normally you hear about we don't hear all of the cases. We hear the ones that stand out and give you that shock and awe, just like you hear a swimmer was attacked by a shark, that's newsworthy, and you kind of have that shock effect. And I think we hear that a lot with the appraisal community. I got a complaint for this. It was a frivolous complaint. And now the dang board's going to get me on this, this, and this, which wasn't even part of the complaint. You bring up a lot of good points there, but perfection's impossible to attain, and competency doesn't require perfection. I quote that a lot. doesn't always help, but nobody's perfect. I used to always say practice makes better, because perfection's impossible. So the old saying, practice makes perfect, I've never liked. Practice makes better, right? So I don't know. And maybe we need to all come together and see if we can figure this thing out, because a lot of appraisers have been in that category. They get a frivolous complaint, and quite frankly, they're scared to death now, because now don't encourage me to become unethical and just hit numbers all the time so that I avoid regulatory complaints. So I don't know. It's something that I think what you said is, if the board could come back and say, look, the basis of the complaint or the alleged violation, we've concluded you didn't do anything wrong. However, there are some other areas over here that you need to polish up on. We could really get you over here in this area, but let's use this as a learning opportunity. Now, I believe you've said in the past, if this is the 7th or 8th time this guy's had a complaint brought in and there's a level of consistency, maybe the disciplinary action would be a little stiffer. So I don't know. Again, this is another topic we could spend a long time discussing, my friend. And unfortunately, we're out of time, and I appreciate you allowing us to go over. Jim, thank you so very much for being on today. We addressed a lot of things. There's a lot of other things I want to pick your brain. So we're going to have you back, and maybe just limit it to a specific topic so we can just spend more time on that particular topic. Thank you very much for being on. Again, if somebody wants to reach out to you directly, they want to correspond with you, they want to understand policy a little bit better, how does somebody get in touch with you?
Sure. Again, my email is jim@asc.gov, and my phone number is 202-595-7575. Bryan, I can't thank you enough for the invitation to share some information about the subcommittee with the audience, and I want to thank all of those of you out there and on the internet for taking some time out of your day to learn a little bit more about the appraisal subcommittee. And feel free to reach out to me anytime.
Great, great. Jim, thanks again so much. You know, it's always a pleasure to put a face with the name, a face with a governing body, if you will. And people now see you're just a real guy, you know, you're not the bad guy. You're a certified general appraiser. You're one of us, for crying out loud. So again, thank you for being here. Thank you guys for watching. I'm Bryan Reynolds. This is the Appraisal Report webinar brought to you every month free of charge by our good friends over at Appraiser eLearning. If you know of someone you'd like to be on the show, please reach out to me or Ben or any of the team down in Nashville. Hal, Jim, Doug, we'll all be happy to talk to you. Have a great day, and thanks for watching.
Bye-bye.